Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm doing another 8 that are great, and this time we're going to be talking about easy to read non-fiction. So it's non-fiction November right now, so I wanted to put out a little bit more non-fiction content, and like the common misconception about non-fiction is that it is very dense and difficult to read, and it's going to take a lot of mental energy to kind of get through it. So what I wanted to do today is to compile a collection of books that I personally found a very easy, light, quick read that are also non-fiction that might be a good starting place if you are intimidated by non-fiction or not too sure where to start with it. So they fall into like loosely two different categories. One is memoirs that I often find are easier to read than more dense factual based non-fiction, and then the other one is what I would almost consider like collated non-fiction, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a second. So the first one that we're going to be talking about is memoir based non-fiction. I do have a whole video talking about memoirs that I'll link down below, and some of these books will be repeated from that, but I do have one or two new ones. The first one of these is Lab Girl by Jahren. This is a memoir about a woman who works within a lab, but she is a specialist in biology, paleobotany, and she kind of focuses on plants. It's a memoir of her time and like her career and how she ended up in the position that she was, so things like funding, the different experiments that she does, the kind of wacky road trip she ends up taking, and it also has sections where it talks about plants and how plants are structured, how they've evolved, and various things like that. Hope has a really lovely writing style, and it is kind of touches on a few deeper topics, but generally is fairly light-hearted and quite amusing, and I definitely found it a fairly breezy read to get through, and it really sparked for me an interest in nature writing, which is also something I'd consider to be a fairly gentle reading topic in non-fiction. So that is another way of potentially introducing more non-fiction into your kind of reading diet. Nature writing tends to be a little bit more relaxed, so that might be a good option as well. The next biography I wanted to talk about is Life on Air by David Attenborough. This is about David Attenborough's career with the BBC and looking at the early advancements in technology to do with filming and the creation of TV and documentaries, and how the work that he did ended up really setting the stage for what the standardized tropes of documentaries were, and also how they ended up getting funding to go out to these various places, and how advancements in technology changed the kind of documentaries that he could make. It's really lovely. He has a great writing style, and depending on how your brain works, I actually read it in his voice, which was really soothing, and I think the autobiography is read by him, which would the audiobook is read by him, which would also be a great way of doing it as well. David Attenborough has a lovely writing style and has a few different books out, so he's worth checking out in general, but this one I really enjoyed. The last biography or memoir type book is Touch Wood by Anonymous. This is the tales of a porn director, and it is as hilarious and light-hearted as you can imagine. That is another thing that I find really helpful in non-fiction, is picking topics that are just generically less serious. There's less like on the line and sort of stakes to it, so they're not going to end up be tugging at your heartstrings in quite the same way or making you mad at the world, which definitely, whilst those books are important and have a place within your reading, it's not necessarily what you want to read all the time. So the story of a porn director is frankly as hilarious as you can imagine. There are a lot of very interesting and entertaining stories. It's not particularly touching on potential exploitation or anything in sex workers. I think that if you wanted to look at that and take it down a more serious road, this isn't the book for you. And it really is kind of before, whilst the internet was around and a thing, it was before that really kicked off and became like, you know, it's before OnlyFans and things like that. So it's looking at a particular relic of the porn industry, and it's just generally really interesting. So I had a giggle with this one. I read it years ago, but I still recommend it tons because I think it's very fun. Okay, now we're going to be talking about sort of collated non-fiction. By that, what I mean is books that take a particular topic, but each individual chapter is almost treated like its own mini essay or book in its own right. We have quite a few in this particular subgenre. The first one is Freakonomics by, I didn't check, Stephen D. Levitt and Stephen J. Dubner. So this is looking at the economics of a variety of different situations and trying to come up with sort of correlation, causation, different economic explanations of why these certain phenomena happen, and sort of the rogue, sort of the hidden side of certain things that happen in life, if that makes sense. So it's looking at, you know, crime trends and all sorts of stuff like that, parenting, traffic jams, all sorts of different mini topics, but it's bouncing around all over the place, which means each individual chapter is a nice little chunk that you can kind of take, read, and then leave alone, rather than having to remember these huge swathes of information that all interconnects. It's a lot more relaxed in its approach, and this is going to be the recurring theme with pretty much the rest of all the non-fiction that I'm going to recommend. So this one is about economics in that style. On a similar vibe, we also have Soccernomics, which again is about the economics of soccer, and this, or football, because I'm in the UK, This is by Simon Kuper and Stefan Szymanski. This is looking at things like, you know, when people transfer from club to club, why does suddenly potentially their playing drop down? Are managers particularly important? Why are certain countries so good on a sort of national scale? What are the different things that feed into how the different leagues work? And it's generally something which is really, really interesting, even if you're not particularly a big football fan. So I don't really watch football, but this was looking at the mechanics behind the scenes of football rather than specifically just the football pitch itself and the game itself. The thing I find super frustrating when you talk to people about football is the general majority of people have a particular team that they like. They are not very objective when they talk about that team, and it's all very sort of clan culture, us against them, and it just creates an environment that I'm not particularly a fan of. Whereas when you get away from that and you're happier at looking at football as a general phenomena, there are genuinely some really, really interesting things that occur on a global, national, local scale. And it's one thing I really appreciate about Andy and his family is they like football, but they like the phenomena of football and talking about football on a much broader scale, and this book really feeds into that. There's probably a newer edition out than this particular one which will have more up-to-date examples. I read this and then tried to join in with a few conversations, and Andy's brother Johnny was like, what year are you living in? I was like, okay, never mind, I tried. But it's genuinely really interesting, and I'd love to read another book like it, potentially in a different sport or a different area. I think it's a really interesting way of approaching topics. Jumping off from sport into, I guess, something still competitive, and that's board games with It's All a Game, A Short History of Board Games by Tristan Donovan. Each individual chapter of this book is looking at a particular board game or subgenre of board game, and it's looking at what we can learn about board games and the concept of play and leisure time in general, and what impact that has, sort of the impacts that culture, society and history can have on those. So it's looking at some of the earliest examples of board games and what we know about them from like really, really ancient times. It's also looking at things like how chess has evolved over the years, and interesting things like the changes in rules. For example, how the Queen became more powerful around a time where queens in monarchy were gaining more power, and there were quite a few very powerful women who were actually on the throne rather than just supporting a husband or a king as such. There's also looking at how the wave of like plastic and very cheap resources changed the board game industry, and how board games can often reflect what is important within a society. For example, games like is it Family Values or whatever that one's called, Monogamy, and also things like Monopoly, which actually was supposed to be a lesson in why capitalism is bad, rather than being the example that it is today of basically being a slumlord landlord monster. It's a really interesting book, and again, it's really light-hearted and it's a lovely read. I blitzed it in a day. I love this one. It's one of my all-time favourites. A throwback to yesteryear that I read a very long time ago but is still absolutely excellent is Elephants on Acid by Alex Boese. This one again is a collection of different sort of bits of information, specifically looking at the really wacky, zany, interesting experiments that have been funded over the years and kind of the rationale behind them. So this one is really, really short snippets, and it is one that you can definitely dive into a lot more. So there's examples of things like, is there a difference between white wine and red wine genuinely? What happens to the spectator effect? And they built like a tiny stadium of cockroaches to get them to be raced, both with an audience and without an audience. They genuinely did give an elephant LSD. It didn't work out so well, but that's where the title comes from. Alex Boese has gone on to write, I believe, 2 more books. One's about the very intense things that scientists have done to their body over the years, and like the sacrifices that they've made, and I can't remember what the other one is. The one's like Electrifying Sheep or something is what it's called. But genuinely, I think he's a very good writer, and it's a really lovely way of being introduced into science writing if you're not somebody who particularly feels confident in the sciences. It will be a little bit out of date now, but it is also mainly looking at history of science, so what probably won't massively matter. And the final one I want to talk about is actually an entire author, their huge back catalogue, but I'm going to give a specific example, and that is Mary Roach. It is no secret on this channel that I absolutely love Mary Roach. She's one of my favourite all-time authors, potentially my like top non-fiction writer that I've read the most of. I have read 4 books of hers, and I've just started a 5th literally last night. And what she does is she takes a particular topic and then researches very intensely into it, and like with all the rest of them, each individual chapter is looking at a slightly different variation of that topic. So this one is about the curious science of humans at war, and is looking at the various different bits of technology that we have and kind of practices that we put in place to help keep people alive in war zones. So it's things like using human cadavers to experiment when it comes to crash test dummies to see how different explosions can impact the human body. It's looking at how those then impact like armored vehicles and things like that. There's sort of research into shark like warding pheromones because of concerns about shark attacks with like planes and boats going down. Generally there's a whole bunch of different things. She also has ones on stuff like the topic of sex, what it's like to try and keep humans alive in space, the various things that happen to human bodies after they die. Generally she's really cool and is an amazing science writer and science/history writer, because it's often a little bit about the history of whatever particular thing that she's talking about, and I just really love her style. She's a very distinctive style of humour as well, which is a little bit more kind of toilet humour, so if that's up your street I think you'll really enjoy her, but if you're not happy to get juvenile and a little bit silly with your humour, you'll find her very irritating, just be warned. So that is it from me. These are some easy, light-hearted, quick non-fiction reads for you if you are looking at Non-Fiction November and saying I'd love to take part but I'm really intimidated by all of people's non-fiction TBRs. They all sound really dense and long. Most of these are fairly short as well, which is also always a bonus, and I actually have another video that I put out recently that was about short non-fiction that if I remember I will link down below. Those are all books that are under 250 pages and I don't believe there's any repeats. Don't quote me on that though. So have any of these been added to your TBR? Are you taking part in Non-Fiction November? Do let me know everything in the comments down below. Have a wonderful reading week and I will chat to you soon. Bye!